the most overrated thing about every UFC GOAT. That's what we're here to talk about, guys. From George St Pierre to Demetrius Johnson to Jon Jones to Jose Aldo to Anderson Silva to Khabib. The greats, guys. You already know what it is. These are going to be the GOATs that most people have on their GOAT list. And I want to say what aspect of their career was overrated. Now, let me say, that's not to take away from their career in general. All these guys are amazing champions, amazing fighters that have consistently been at the top of their divisions during their time. They're all great. They're all amazing. There's no denying that. But why not go and critique them and point out maybe something that's overrated about them? Let's get right into it, guys. So let's start off with Jose Aldo. I think Jose Aldo's bantamweight career has been a little overrated because the narrative around Jose Aldo's bantamweight career is like, man, how good is Jose Aldo at bantamweight? Well, let's see how good he was. He's 4-4 at bantamweight, right? His best wins are his only wins are Jonathan Martinez, Rob Font, Pedro Munoz, and Marlon Vera. Now, guys, listen, you don't need to be a genius to know that these wins are not the best. Marlon Vera, he's not very good. I know a lot of people like to tout Marlon Vera up as like a great fighter, but Marlon Vera's not very good. Pedro Munoz, not the best. Rob Font's decent right now. And then Jonathan Martinez, who's on a 2-fight losing streak now. So it's like his bantamweight career has been decent, but when he entered the bantamweight division, he entered the bantamweight division coming off a loss to Volkanovski, I believe, at featherweight. He moved down and he faced Marlon Moraes in his debut at bantamweight. He lost that fight. And I get it. It was a close fight. You could argue Aldo won, but he lost that fight. And then he was given a title shot against Petr Yan off a loss, which I never like guys getting a title shot off a loss. I know he's a legend. It's Jose Aldo. Give him a title shot. But then he got brutalized in that Petr Yan fight. Listen, guys, I love Jose Aldo. He's had one of the craziest featherweight careers. But when we're talking about his bantamweight career, I will have to say it is a little bit overrated. To me, he needed to beat better guys to be considered successful, so to speak, at bantamweight. I know a lot of people are going to say, dude, he went down to bantamweight in his later 30s. And I get that. And that in itself is impressive. But we're not talking about how old they were and all this, guys. We're talking about, at its core, him going down to bantamweight, the credit he gets for it and like how great he is as a bantamweight is a little overrated. I think he was a much better featherweight, in my opinion. Let's move on to the next on this list. We got Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, if you guys know, you know, his level of competition was overrated. And when I say that, the aspect of it that was overrated is Khabib never fought anyone that could threaten dangerous submissions or threaten his style with like a good counter, you know? Like Islam Makhachev, he beat a Charles Oliveira, he beat a Arman Sarukian, a guy who can challenge him in the area he's greatest at, who can threaten submissions and end the fight anywhere. Khabib just never had that. He fought a Justin Gaethje, who's one of the worst jiu-jitsu guys we've ever seen. That's one of his best wins. Dustin Poirier, fair enough, he's okay on the ground, but he's always struggled against grapplers. In fact, he's been submitted in all 3 of his title fights at lightweight. And then Conor McGregor was coming off the Floyd Mayweather fight, just made $100 million. How motivated is Conor McGregor? His foot was a balloon. Rafael dos Anjos back in the day, and Edson Barboza. So I just feel like Khabib's level of competition he fought, obviously, the fact that he retired too early is always going to be there too. But the level of competition he fought wasn't that great. And I felt like if he'd have stuck around for like another year or two, we would really be talking about Khabib being like 2 or 1 in the GOAT conversation. Because this guy, his fight IQ and his dominance was off the charts. One of the only UFC fighters who's 13-0 in the UFC, never got cut, and just insanity. Like the fact that you can go through an entire UFC career and not get cut a single time is crazy. Just because like, the UFC, we see it every day. I mean, look at Islam Makhachev, who followed Khabib after him. He had a bunch of wars, and he's taken a lot of damage, and it shows on his face in the Volkanovski fight, in the Dustin fight. You can see he's getting pieced up. Khabib never had that. Khabib's always had a clean face. But like I said, the overrated thing about Khabib's career for me would have to be the level of competition, and he never fought a guy that can give like dangerous threat to his style. His style was heavy pressure grappling. He never fought a guy that can throw up dangerous submissions. Yeah, Dustin Poirier threw up a goated guillotine against him, but it's Dustin Poirier, dude. He's never landed that guillotine in his entire career. He was not going to land it against Khabib. Khabib needed that Charles Oliveira on his record to really say, hey, it doesn't matter how good you are at jiu-jitsu, I'm going to smash you. And I do think he would have beat Tony Ferguson. Now that we know what we know, I think he would have destroyed Tony Ferguson, but I needed to see him face a dangerous grappler, and he didn't, but respect to Khabib. the second best lightweight of all time behind Islam, in my opinion. One of the GOATs, no doubt. Let's move on to the next one on this list. We got Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. Now, the thing about Demetrius Johnson's resume that I think is overrated as a GOAT is his title defenses. People tout Demetrius Johnson and says, how good is Demetrius Johnson, man? 11 title defenses. And listen, skill for skill, Demetrius Johnson's one of the best fighters ever. Like, if we're talking just strictly skills and not who he beat, this guy has some of the greatest jiu-jitsu. He has good wrestling. He has good striking. Like, just one of the most well-rounded fighters ever in the history of mixed martial arts. But when you look at his levels of competition, guys, that's where it's lacking. Let's look at these title defenses. He has the most title defenses in UFC history, but I think the aspect of title defenses itself can be a little overrated. He has 2 wins against John Dodson, Joseph Benavidez. Those are solid wins. John Moraga, what has John Moraga done? Ali Bagatinov, what has he done? Chris Carriasso, Kyoji Arguchi, decent. Henry Cejudo, good. He Tim Elliott, who nearly submitted him in the first round, but he went on to dominate that fight. Wilson Hayes and Ray Borg. So if you look at these names, guys, and I know Demetrius Johnson did what he had to do at flyweight. He went in his division, he won the belt, and then he dismantled and destroyed the competition. Listen, Demetrius Johnson was so dominant, he was literally doing trick shots on his opponents, flying arm bars against Ray Borg. He was submitting black belts and Wilson Hayes. I mean, this dude did it all. He destroyed Henry Cejudo in their first fight. But like I said, I think the whole aspect of having like 11 title defenses is a little overrated. He was the first flyweight champion, and just the levels of competition weren't that great. And I think in the modern era, nobody's going to beat 11 title defenses because the UFC fighters today are just getting so much more well-rounded and like just overall way better. So it's a lot harder to like come around and like get 11 title defenses. Like these days, 4 title defenses is like insane. Like people are like, man, if Islam gets 4 title defenses, how crazy is that? And I understand that argument because the levels of competition are just so high these days. It's really hard to hold on to that belt. So you really got to appreciate these guys for holding on to it. Like I said, there is something to say about staying at the top of your division for so long and getting all these title defenses, but the aspect of him having 11 title defenses is a little overrated if you look at the level of competition he faced. Let's move on to the next one, guys. We're looking at Jon Jones. Now, the biggest thing for Jon Jones, for me, that's overrated is the aspect of him being undefeated. That's what I think. Jon Jones being undefeated is extremely overrated. No matter which way you want to put it, whether you want to count the loss versus Matt Hamill and say he has a loss there, or you want to say he lost the first Gus fight, you could argue that, or you want to say he lost to Dominic Reyes, which is one of the most blatant championship robberies in modern day UFC, 3-2 Dominic Reyes. Or you can, some people even argue that he lost to Thiago Santos. That was a really close fight. I think he won, but it was a close fight. So I think the whole thing of like, man, how good is Jon Jones? He's never lost. I think that whole aspect is overrated. And because, like, come on, guys, we know he lost to Dominic Reyes. We just do. Like, if you're not biased towards Jon Jones and you're not just like right on his coattails to have a Michael Jordan of the sport, you know that 100% he lost to Dominic Reyes. He lost rounds 1, 2, and 3. It doesn't matter if you come back in the championship rounds and you win those 2 rounds. That doesn't win you the whole fight. The fights are judged by a round-by-round basis. And if you watch that fight back, Dominic Reyes outstruck him in all 3 of the first 3 rounds and clearly was in control of the fight. Won the first 3 rounds, lost the last 2. 3-2 Dominic Reyes. He should have been the first guy to officially defeat Jon Jones in the UFC. And maybe Matt Hamill, but that was a disqualification. But yeah, man, I think there's a real argument he lost that Gustafsson 1 fight as well. Like, you could make an argument he won, but you could also make an argument he lost. And it's like, the aspect of him being overrated, so to speak, is undefeated is highly overrated because Jon Jones has lost. That's just what it is, guys. He's lost. And if we look at the latter half of Jon Jones' career, I can say another overrated thing. He hasn't faced the best competition. Look at his most recent light heavyweight run. Gustafsson, decent win. Anthony Smith, that's who he beat. Thiago Santos, that's who he beat, dude. Dominic Reyes, all these guys are like 2-8 in their last 10 fights. You know what I'm saying? Like, Jon Jones being undefeated is massively overrated, in my opinion. He has losses, and I'll die on that hill. But yeah, he still has the most impressive resume to date in terms of people he's beaten overall. But I think he has taken some losses, whether you want to admit it or not. At least 2. One to Hamill for disqualification and one to Dominic Reyes. You could argue 4 losses. That's crazy. Jon Jones in another world, if the judges aren't feeling generous, he has 4 losses. So let's not pretend like this guy's like, oh my God, dude, how good is Jon Jones? He just beat a 42-year-old retired St Pierre, the GOAT, dude. Anyways, you guys know I can hit on Jon Jones to the end of time. Let's move on to the next one on this list. We got Anderson the Spider Silva. Now, the overrated thing about Anderson Silva was his level of competition. Let's be real, guys. He has the longest win streak in UFC history at 16-0. But man, did Anderson Silva beat some taxi drivers, boys. You already know it. He beat Rich Franklin twice. Rich Franklin, Dan Henderson, okay, decent win, good win. Dan Henderson was a legend. James Irvin, Patrick Cote, Tyler Slatis, boo. Forrest Griffin, boo. Former champion, but Forrest Griffin here. Damian Maia, boring fight, decent win. Dominated by Chael Sonnen in the first fight to latch up a last-minute Hail Mary submission. Chael Sonnen never was that great either. Vitor Belfort, solid win, former champion. Yujin Okami, Stephan Bonner. Like, look at the names on this list, guys. And I think you do have to consider Anderson Silva a GOAT just for the fact that he went 16-0 to his UFC start. There is something to say about the amount of losses that he had. He had a lot of losses at the end of his career. And a lot of people give him a free pass. They're like, oh, man, he was past his prime. Still, man, losses are losses. If you stick around, to some degree, it has to go against your legacy. But like I said, if we're looking at what is specifically overrated for me about Anderson Silva, I have to say his level of competition. Because people are like, man, Anderson Silva's 7-year title reign, just complete domination. Yeah, but he was fighting cab drivers. I think you can take a lot of guys in the UFC who are maybe a good UFC fighter, not a great UFC fighter, and you put them against cab drivers, and, you know, they're going to knock them out of the park every time, brother. They're going to be submitting and knocking them out and looking like they're in the Matrix. And that's exactly what Anderson Silva was doing. He was showboating and emoting on people on the feet because he was so damn good on the feet. And yeah, I don't think Anderson Silva's skills were overrated. I still think he was an amazing fighter. I think the levels of competition he beat were overrated, and like the whole like aspect of like him being the longest reigning champion in UFC history and all that good stuff. You guys get it. Anderson Silva, levels of competition, overrated. Let's move on to the next one. George St Pierre. I think his double champ status is massively overrated. Listen, George St Pierre, the whole like narrative of like, I mean, how good is George St Pierre? He takes off 4 years and comes back to win the middleweight belt. Yeah, that sounds great, but when you really look at it on paper, he won the middleweight belt off of one of the worst UFC champions in the modern era in Michael Bisping. Listen, Michael Bisping won the belt off of a fluke, what I would say was a fluke win off of Luke Rockhold, because Luke Rockhold had already beat him. Luke Rockhold was overconfident, got KO'd by Michael Bisping. Let's say it's not even a fluke win. Michael Bisping legit beat Luke Rockhold, destroyed him, pummeled him. He's still one of the worst champions in the modern era, Michael Bisping. He's always was a journeyman. He ended up getting the belt, and GSP saw that Michael Bisping was middleweight champion. He's like, you know what? I can go up and win that middleweight belt. I guarantee you, if the middleweight champion was Robert Whittaker or Yoel Romero at the time, there's no way GSP was coming back to fight them. And he beat Michael Bisping, won the belt, right? And he even made an agreement with the UFC that he was going to defend the title if he won the belt. He didn't stick his end of that agreement. He went ahead and said, you know what, guys, I have colitis. I'm going to ride into the sunset, and that's it. What a coincidence when it comes for George St. Pierre to defend the belt. He has colitis, guys. I'm not saying he's lying, but it's extremely convenient. And he ducked Robert Whittaker and Yoel Romero. Michael Bisping, also one of the biggest ducks. He chose, instead of fighting Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker, Michael Bisping went on to fight Dan Henderson, of all people, who was number 14 and 46 years old at the time, and then GSP, which fair enough to Michael Bisping. He secured the bag. I'm not mad at him for that. But the double champ status of GSP definitely has asterisks around it just because it was Michael Bisping, and Michael Bisping wasn't great, and then he didn't defend the belt after to legitimize that second championship, in my opinion. So it's like, was he really the middleweight champion? He was, but was he really? To me, a champion gets his belt and defends his belt. So GSP, no doubt, the best welterweight of all time. But when we're talking about sheer like middleweight championship status, you got to put that double champ status into question when you're looking at GSP. Let's look at the last one on this list, guys. Alexander Volkanovski. I think his resume in itself is a little overrated. He is one of the GOATs just because skill for skill. He's one of the best fighters ever that we've ever seen. He's one of the best strikers we've ever seen. But when you look at the guys he's beat, that Max Holloway 3 wins are carrying this guy's legacy heavy. If you take Max Holloway times 3 off his resume, it's not that great, guys. But I love Volkanovski, but I think his resume is a little overrated. Let's look who he beat. Mizuto Hirota, I can. Shane Young, I'd say I can. Jeremy Kennedy, I can. Darren Elkins is a solid win. Darren Elkins is a good perennial contender at featherweight. Maybe not a top contender, but he was in there. Chad Mendez, solid win. Chad Mendez was a little bit older, but solid win. Jose Aldo, I'd still say that's a great Jose Aldo. He was only 33 years old. And yeah, he outworked Jose Aldo and just out-techniqued him. Max Holloway ×3. Now this is carrying his resume heavy. He beat Max Holloway in the first fight, and which was quite a good win at the time. A lot of people thought that Max Holloway was going to steamroll. Like, who is this Volkanovski dude? He's about to get smoked. And in the rematch, Holloway arguably won, landing 2 head kicks, but then Volk came back by the judges seeing to win the last 3 rounds. So he's 2-0 up against Holloway, but the fans are up in arms. They're like, you know what? I think Holloway beat him in that rematch. I want to see a third fight. And in the third fight, he completely destroys Max Holloway, puts on a boxing clinic, puts a cut over his eye in the first round, and just dominates him. So he has 3 wins over Max Holloway, which in my opinion are heavily carrying his legacy. Because then if you look at his last 3 wins, Brian Ortega, he's okay, he's mid. Never, always struggled in championship fights. Korean Zombie, past his prime. And then Yair Rodriguez. Solid win, but Yair he's okay. Kind of a pipsqueak, as Lucas Tracy would say. But you get my point, guys. I think Volkanovski's resume itself is a little overrated. And now you take into account that he's coming off of 2 KO losses to Islam Makhachev. And listen, I think there is something to say about him losing to Islam Makhachev up a weight class and looking amazing. You could almost argue he won that fight. But at the end of the day, guys, on paper, as Anthony Smith would say, he lost that fight. So you really can't sit here and say, man, Alexander Volkanovski has a win over Islam. Because on paper, he doesn't. So when we're looking at his UFC wins and his resume objectively, I think you have to say it's a little bit overrated. Like I said, it's being heavily carried by those Max Holloway wins, because outside of that, if you take the Max Holloway wins away, his resume isn't that great. Nonetheless, skill for skill, Volkanovski, one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen. Listen, guys, this was my list of critiquing something overrated about all the GOATs. That's not to say these guys aren't amazing. These guys are some of the greatest fighters. They are the greatest fighters we've ever seen so far in the sport. So I'm not trying to take away anything from their careers. I'm just trying to say this aspect, one way or another, was overrated. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys like the overrated, underrated type videos? Are you guys tired of me dunking on these UFC champions? Let me know. I know a lot of people are in the comments are like, man, you think everyone's overrated. Who's good to you? Who impresses you? And I think it's okay to point out something that's overrated while also appreciating their legacy. And I do appreciate these guys' legacies. It's gave us some of the best fights you've ever seen. So, yeah. Thank you for watching, guys. Drop a comment, drop a like, drop a sub if you enjoy the content. Become a member of the channel, and I'm out, guys. Peace.